Hello everyone, I'm not sure when this will be uploaded, so I hope you had or are having a very happy and healthy holiday season. Merry Christmas if you celebrate Christmas. So two of us here at Catalog attempted to make outdoor winter scenes using the new Christmas decorations from Podium Browser. So I'm going to go ahead and do a breakdown of this scene, but first I want to show you the results that we came up with. So this was an image that Dave made using all of the new outdoor holiday decorations, and this was rendered with ProWalker GPU. And this is the scene that I worked on, and I'll go through a little bit about how it was constructed a little bit later, but this was the final result of that, and I also rendered mine in ProWalker GPU at a pretty high resolution so we can see all these nice details. So that was the finished still image, and we both created animations with ProWalker from these projects. So here is Dave's ProWalker animation, 500 samples per frame, with the denoiser turned on. And here was mine, just a simple camera zoom from point A to point B, also rendered with 500 samples per frame. I wish I had time to go back and redo the color because overall I think this is a little bit too blue feeling, but that is the result. But I do like the way the colors turned out in the still image a little bit better. Okay, anyway, before I go ahead and talk about the render settings and construction of this scene, I just wanted to show you a couple other winter renders that some of our users have done in the past. This one was done by Andrew Trodler. And I think it's probably the best snow scene that I've seen with SU Podium. He actually took the time to, it looks like, modify one of these trees to add snow on all the limbs. And also found these nice snowy tree images to use. But what really impressed me was these snowy paths. It looks like what he did was made grooves in a plane and then used a scattering plugin to scatter little bits of snow all over these tracks, and it just looks really, really good. And then this was an interior that I loved. This was from 2 years ago by Eduardo Camara. It was for we had a holiday contest a couple years ago, and I think this got second place, and Andrew got first place in that contest. But I just thought the lighting was really, really beautiful, and this makes great use of some of the Podium Browser interior Christmas decorations. And then here was another one by Patrick Flynn using the same exact tree in a very different looking interior. So I thought those were some really successful winter holiday renders from users, and then this one by me, this one by Dave. All right, so let's go ahead and go through how this was created. Okay, I started this scene by modeling the A-frame cabin. The cabin and the snow are actually the only things that I modeled by hand. Everything else in the image is from Podium Browser. So I started with just a simple A-frame cabin model, and this is basic SketchUp stuff. It's not very complicated. I was looking at a reference image that I found. I think I saw it on Instagram, and coincidentally, this cabin happens to be pretty close to where we live. It's located near Skykomish, Washington, and we're up here in Bellingham. So I found this cabin and just modeled it by eye, trying to get the proportions as close as I could without getting too crazy and too detailed. I did stick some furniture from Podium Browser in the interior. This was a living room assembly, a dining assembly, and one of the stoves from the living accessories section, I believe. And I just extended the stovepipe so it stuck through the ceiling. So that was the start. The next thing that I worked on was the snowy terrain, and that was probably the most challenging part of the process. I also added some snow to the deck and to the roof. So this is my snowy ground geometry. You can see it's just some gently rolling hills or mounds of snow around the cabin, and then I modeled this path directly into the geometry. So this is actually a really high polygon solution. There are some other ways to do this in SketchUp that are a little bit more user-friendly. I ended up sculpting my terrain using digital sculpting software, but there are ways to do this just with SketchUp's native tools. So let me go over to this example scene, and I'll show you a couple options for creating snowy terrain. So the first example I want to show is a sandbox terrain. You can create a sandbox under Draw Sandbox from scratch, and then you just determine the grid spacing by typing it in. These were 5 feet apart. And then what you can do is open the sandbox by double-clicking, go to Tools, Sandbox, Smooth, and that gives you a big brush with a radius, and you can move geometry with a gentle fall off. So if I click here, we can start adding some terrain variation, and that's a good way to get those gently rolling mounds of snow or sort of hills and sculpt something that looks like a very natural environment. So that would be one way to sort of get this terrain variation that you see around the cabin. Now, this goes one step further in the sense that it's also got this sort of smaller, higher frequency detail. And there's a plugin in SketchUp called Erode that can sort of do this almost automatically. So if I come back to the example scene on this second plane here, I've got this plugin installed called Erode, and it's by Enroth, and you can find it on Sketchucation. Enroth's Fractal Terrain Eroder. It's just a simple plugin that you can install from the extension manager, and what it does is automatically adds variation to geometry. So select this whole plane, make sure all the faces are selected, go to Extensions, Erode. I'm just going to go to Iterations 1 and set the pointiness down to 0.2. Click OK, and in a few seconds we'll see what this does. Okay, so there's the result. As you can see, what it did was sort of just added random variation to all the points on this mesh. So now we have something that looks a lot more like snow. It's not as uniform as plain old SketchUp geometry. We've got these small, subtle bumps, sort of like what we see in the terrain here in the cabin project. So you actually can use the Erode tool on a sandbox terrain as well. It just might take some time for a dense sandbox like this. You probably would want to start with the grid about 10 feet apart before using the Erode tool, or just make sure you save first and be ready to wait several minutes. So if I come up to Extensions, Erode, again, I want to change the iterations to 1 because 2 takes probably twice as long or even longer. I'm just going to drop this down to 0.1. I want very subtle variation on this and click OK. And I'll just pause the recording and then show you the result. Okay, so that finished. Now if I go to View and uncheck Hidden Geometry, it's going to turn off those lines, and we can see we now have this sandbox terrain with some very subtle bumps on it. And we're getting some natural looking variation that really does sort of look like rolling hills covered in snow. All right, so those are a few ideas for creating snow right inside SketchUp. Now, the remaining challenge is how we can get these organic looking edges on the snow where it meets the path. And this is probably the most challenging part. As I mentioned before, I didn't actually end up doing mine in SketchUp. I exported my terrain as Collada DAE to Blender, and then I sculpted this path using Blender's brush tools, and then brought it back into SketchUp as an FBX file using an importer plugin. So it's kind of a lot. I think it's definitely beyond the scope of this tutorial, and it requires you to have working knowledge of both software applications. So I'm not going to talk about the way I made the path. I think if you have the time and the knowledge to do it, it looks pretty cool. But if you don't have knowledge of a third-party application, like I said before, Andrew Trodler in his outdoor image was actually able to get really, really great organic-looking snow just using basic SketchUp tools by creating some grooves in a plane and then scattering some little pebble-like pieces of snow geometry around these paths. And actually, Dave came up with a pretty interesting way to make a snowy path using the SketchUp Fur plugin. So if I zoom along this path here, you can see it's got those pretty nice irregular edges, and at a quick glance, it's pretty convincing. So what Dave did, I believe, is used a plugin called Make Fur. It's a pretty old plugin. It's been around since 2014, and it's available on Sketchucation. What you do is you create a couple of components. So I've got these sort of half dome shaped little pieces of snow that I'm going to scatter across this plane geometry. So we go in and enter the group. I'm going to choose this face and leave these little gutters here alongside the path as sort of like a buffer zone. And then we go to Extensions, Fur, choose the Crowd option. I want to select the components that I'm going to scatter. So snow, snow 1, snow 3. You choose a density, and when you update this slider, it should show you a preview. These little proxies show up on the mesh where each component's going to be. Size jitter just means it adds some random variation to the size of these pieces. I just set that to 5%, so they can either be 5% larger or 5% smaller than their initial size. And then we just click Make Crowd, and it's going to scatter these pieces, and you'll see how that gives us sort of a quick instant path. And at a quick glance, it's also pretty convincing. So in 1 second, we're going to see all these domes show up. I'll go to View, uncheck Hidden Geometry. And remember, when we render this, we're not going to see these black SketchUp edges. This is all going to blend together and sort of look like a snowy path with irregular edges. And of course, you can go in, double-click to enter the group, and you can just, refine the edges of the path using these domes. So, I can move this back if I think it's sticking out too far, and duplicate to fill in spots where I think it needs a little bit more snow. And so that is just another really quick, basically automatic way to create a path. And that's pretty close to what Dave used, I think, in his animation. It's sort of obvious here. You can see the rounded edges toward the edge of this. But because because it's moving through the scene, your eye is never going to settle on those individual pieces for very long. And so it ends up being a pretty convincing effect. All right, so that pretty much takes care of the snow process, I think. I did add snow to the deck and stairs, and then also on the roof. And the same sort of techniques apply. If you're going to be doing this directly in SketchUp, there are 3 plugins that I recommend for this kind of geometry manipulation. So Vertex Tools by Evil Empire Software lets you manipulate individual vertices on your SketchUp mesh, and that's how you can get these sort of precise squiggly pieces of snow on the stairs here. And then they also make a plugin called Subdi, which is for subdividing and smoothing geometry, or an alternative to that is called Artisan by Mindsight Studios. And these are all very good organic modeling tools for SketchUp that let you accomplish this sort of stuff. And then used in conjunction with that fractal Erode plugin, you can get nice, bumps and variations on your mesh. I'm going to move on to go back to my starting camera and start talking about adding the forest and the decorations, and then talk about lighting. And actually, lighting this scene was really, really easy because all those Podium Browser Christmas decorations are already set up with lights. So let's move on to the next section. Okay, I wanted the cabin to feel like it was sitting sort of deep in an old Douglas fir style forest like we have in the Pacific Northwest. So the first thing I did was added a ring of trees around the background just to sort of obscure the horizon. And for this, I used 360 degree forest 03, and that's under environment backgrounds 360. It won't really be visible in the final shot, but it does sort of block out the horizon in some cases when there's a gap in the 3D trees that I'm going to be using in the foreground. For the midground, I filled the area around and behind the cabin with some large fir trees from Podium Browser. These are pretty high poly, so I definitely recommend if you're using this many 3D trees, you keep them on their own SketchUp tag or layer so that you can turn them on and off so it doesn't slow down the viewport too much. And these are from Podium Browser. It's a component called Silver Fir. So if you look in Podium Browser, go to Home, Vegetation, 3D Trees, and then just type fir into the search bar. You'll find this silver fir component. It's 74 megabytes, so it does take a little while to download, but it comes into the scene as a large group of variously sized fir trees, and they're pretty widely spaced. So if we look at it right here next to the scale reference figure, it definitely gives the impression of a pretty old, mature second growth forest. And if you just duplicate this component a couple of times and rotate it around, you can easily get the feeling that you're sitting in the middle of a nice lush forest. And actually from this camera angle, you can see through the gaps in these 3D trees where that 2D ring of trees is showing through. So like I said, that just helps obscure the horizon and sort of enforces the illusion that we're in the middle of a lush forest. Okay, the next thing I did was set up the camera view for the final render and then added a couple more foreground trees. So under camera, I just went to field of view and set the focal length to 42 millimeters. And then I moved the camera into the position that you see here. I just wanted it to be a nice symmetrical composition with the cabin pretty much dead center. And then I saved a SketchUp scene and added 3 or 4 additional trees in the foreground to just sort of frame the image and give it a little bit more visual interest here in the foreground. So I liked the way this one sort of blocked off the right side of the frame, and then this one here in between these other 2 big ones. And that ended up looking pretty good in the final image. And then from this point, it was just a matter of decorating the scene. Okay, there's not too much explanation required in this section because I just used Podium Browser for all the Christmas decorations in this scene. So everything you see here is from Podium Browser under Home, Holiday, Christmas, and we have about 197 items. I can just set this to 200 so we can see them all. And all I did was, downloaded Christmas decorations into the scene and arranged them specifically from this camera view so that they looked the way I wanted them. And in some cases, I did make slight modifications to the scale. I believe I scaled this deer up so that it was sort of filling this space nicely. I also hid the colors that were originally on these deer just because I thought the render looked a little bit better without the colors there. All of these trees are set up with lights, and they came from the same Christmas Yard Decor 5 component. I just downloaded that into the scene, and then I exploded the component and moved the individual trees where I wanted them in the image. Same with this one here on the deck. I believe that component originally contained 2 potted trees, and I just deleted one of them because I only needed the one tree. I don't think I made any changes to any of the other yard decor. Those were just downloaded straight from Podium Browser and placed where I wanted them in the image. So these inflatable ones, this stack of gifts, these snowflakes along the path, I just downloaded from Podium Browser and put them where I wanted them. And then the only thing left was these Christmas lights and little drapes of holly on the facade of the A-frame. So let me zoom in here. All right, so you can see I put a Christmas tree in the interior. Along this horizontal bar, I used this 6-foot pre-lit natural classic garland and just duplicated it twice, I think. For the vertical, I believe that came from this Christmas decor component, and then I just deleted the top section and placed these along the sides of the door. The Christmas lights on the A-frame were Christmas Lights 1 from Podium Browser. And from this angle, you can see all I did was rotated them and duplicated that Christmas light component end to end, and then flipped it horizontal and duplicated it over to the other side. So that's pretty much the setup for all the Christmas decorations. The lights do download into the scene pre-configured with SU Podium LEM properties. So if I open the Material Properties dialog, take the color picker and select one of these lights, we've got Podium Christmas Lights 1 material, and it's got an LEM power of 30. And I believe that's consistent with all of the SU Podium Christmas decorations. So if I zoom out here to the exterior trees, for example, and select one of these lights, I think all the Christmas decorations are set to an LEM power of 30. And that works pretty well with SU Podium. And then if we use ProWalker GPU to render, we're able to change the LEM strength dynamically. Okay, so that is an overview of the Christmas decorations in this scene. If you ever want to create a custom strand of lights like this, there's this plugin available on Sketchucation called Copy Along Curve, and it makes it really easy to copy a component or group along a curve or edge. So let me go back to SketchUp, and what I've done is placed this SketchUp curve right across this opening. I just used the 3-point curve, and then I downloaded the Christmas decorations, the Christmas lights decoration, and removed all the pieces except for this one blue light. And what we're going to do is copy this light along this path. So go to Extensions, Copy Along Curve, then you select the component that you want to copy, select the curve, and we'll see a bunch of proxies show up. So we can change the spacing or the number of copies. So to change the spacing, you just type in, like 10 inches and they get further apart. Or if you want copies, you can type in like 5 and then you type C, and that updates the proxies right there in the viewport. So let's say we want these spaced 4 inches apart, and it's going to create quite a few copies. Then I just need to click anywhere else in the viewport. You'll see a green check, and there we have a bunch of Christmas lights right on this strand, and you could use the Follow Me tool to give this some thickness. Okay, so that's just one idea for creating custom string lights. In the next section, we're going to go back to the cabin scene and talk about render settings and how to export the final render from ProWalker GPU. All right, lighting and render settings. So rendering this scene with ProWalker GPU is actually extremely easy because almost all the lighting in the scene is going to come from these Podium Browser Christmas decorations. So before I launch ProWalker, I want to talk about the snow real quick. If I open the Material Properties dialog and select the snow material, you can see I'm using a diffuse value of 100% and a bump depth of 6. And then it does have a subtle snow texture that I found online on textures.com. So I decided to go with 100% diffuse. I also tried a couple test renders with a little bit of reflection, like 3 or 4% reflection, but I thought the snow ended up looking a little bit too much like snow would look after a freezing rain, like it had melted and then refrozen, and it was just a little bit too shiny. So I set the diffuse value back to 100%, and I thought the snow looked a little bit better that way. So that's pretty much the only custom material setting. Everything else was directly from Podium Browser, so I can go ahead and launch ProWalker GPU, and after a few minutes, once that launches, we're going to see our preview image in the ProWalker viewport, and it's really noisy right now because I have the samples set to 5, but obviously in the final render we're going to make that a lot higher so that this image gets much, much clearer. But before we talk about samples, let's address the lighting. So I'm going to close this render settings dialog, and one big glaring difference between this preview image and the finished render is that we're seeing this really blue sky in the background with a cloud. And I want this to be a night scene. So the first thing we want to do is open the background settings dialog. We are going to use HDRI, but instead of afternoon 1, I actually just changed it to morning, and that's going to update in the viewport. So it gets a little bit darker right away, and then I changed the offset to 79. And I think I chose that based on the fact that at 79 there were no clouds visible through this little hole, right? So that looks good. And then what I did was opened the lighting and tone map settings, and the physical slider controls the brightness of the background. So I actually set this to 0.4, right? And now this is starting to look a lot more like a night scene. All of the other lights in the scene are light-emitting materials, so we have the LEM slider that we can use to control the overall brightness of these Christmas lights. So for example, if I take the LEM slider and bring it all the way down to 0.1, this scene is going to refresh, and these LEM lights are going to be significantly dimmer. So there it is with the LEMs all the way down to 0.1. And likewise, if you increase that above 1, the LEMs are going to get brighter. So here it is rendering with the LEMs all the way up at 1.9, and this is clearly too bright. Actually, I eventually decided that even 1 was a little bit too bright, so I used a value of 0.5 for my LEM slider, Obviously, this is going to vary from scene to scene, so you'll just have to play with these controls yourself and find out what works best for your image, but ultimately I decided physical 0.4 and LEM 0.5 looked best in my image, and if I turn the denoiser on, we might be able to see this a little bit more clearly. So that's going to start rendering over again, but you can see with that denoiser on, it gets pretty blurry at first, but as the samples start to add, it's going to become a little bit clearer. And this is basically the final render settings that I used for my image. I did do quite a bit of post-processing afterwards to get rid of this sort of yellow tone that I thought was just a little bit too yellow, but let's talk about samples and export settings and try and wrap up this tutorial. Render quality in ProWalker GPU is primarily determined by the number of samples you let ProWalker use for the image, and that's configured from the render settings dialog, which is the gear icon. Right here we have a samples field, and what you're seeing in the preview image is 250 samples. And I think it's pretty obvious from the preview that that's not quite enough. The image is still pretty noisy. We have all these flickers, sometimes called fireflies, throughout the image. And what that means is that we just need to add a higher sample count. So one thing ProWalker has is a denoising algorithm, which is this button right here. And if I turn on the denoiser, we're going to see almost all this noise is going to disappear, but the image is going to get a little bit blurrier. Okay, so that's with the denoiser turned on. The image does look better, but it doesn't look perfect. And that's, again, because there aren't enough samples for ProWalker to accurately detect where the edges are when it applies the denoising algorithm. So what I decided was the minimum for this scene to look good with the denoiser was about 500. So if we switch that number to 500 and click OK, the preview render is going to start over with 500 samples instead of 250. I'm just going to pause that real quick and show you what the result looks like. And the resulting render looks something like this. This is that scene with 500 samples rendered at 1920 by 1080. So if I zoom in a little bit, you can see it doesn't look bad. We're not getting any noise. Most of the edges are reasonably sharp, but it could be better. So what I ended up doing for the final render was increase the render size from 1920 to 4000 pixels on the wide axis, and then increase the number of samples to 4000 samples. So this was the image at 500 samples with a 1920 by 1080 resolution, and then this was the final raw render at 4000 samples and 4500 pixels on the wide axis. It's not glaringly obvious, but if you look closely, you can see the larger image with more samples is a lot sharper and the details are just a lot clearer. I did also move the tree slightly, but you can ignore that. So I'm just going to zoom in here on this Christmas decoration on the left side. This is the original image at 500 samples. And now here it is with the resolution increased and the samples increased. And then likewise, if we zoom in on the facade here, this is what it looked like at 500 samples. And now if I go back to the full-size render and zoom in on these details, it just looks a lot better with the 4000 samples and the larger image size. Now that does increase the render time. In my case, it increased the render time from about 4 minutes to over an hour for this high resolution render. But if you have the time and you can let the render run overnight or during some downtime in the office, then it's definitely worth it. But otherwise, it still looks pretty good with only 500 samples. And actually, this 500 samples is definitely good enough for rendering animation. But for still images, when you have the luxury of time, more samples do look better. So to render your final image, go back to SketchUp. Make sure you've got all your settings the way you want them. So I've got morning HDR, 79 offset. I have both my physical sky and my LEM bumped down a little bit to 0.4 and 0.5. Come in here to configure samples. And remember, I said I wanted 4000 samples. Click OK. Choose whether you want the denoiser on or off. I did turn it off in my case. And then click the Capture an Image button to render your final image. So I'll click the camera icon. Choose your image resolution. If you choose window size, it'll render at the size of the ProWalker viewport, or you can use a custom image resolution. Mine was 4500 by about 2600, I think. Then when you click OK, it's going to open an image save dialog. Choose where you want to save it. Give it a file name. Click Save. You're going to see a progress bar, and it's going to start rendering your image. All right, before I wrap up the video, I'm just going to show you the post-processing that I did to finish off the image. So this was the raw render from ProWalker GPU. I've got it open here in Photoshop. And I'm just going to show you how a few slight changes can make this look a little bit better. I mentioned before that I wasn't happy with how yellow this turned out. And that's just because the LEM material on these lights had a yellow tint to it, but we can easily take care of that with some color correction. So starting here with the base render, the very first thing I did was a levels adjustment under Layer, New Adjustment Layer, Levels. So if I turn that layer on, you can see that improves the look of the image quite a bit already. And my leveling process is usually to set the white point. So I open a levels adjustment layer, click this eyedropper, which is to set the white point, and choose it. And I choose a point that I think should be more white than it is in the image. And for me, that was the snowman. So you click here, and that resets the white balance. We've got our white point neutralized, and already the image looks a lot better. You can also set the black point and the gray point, but in my case, I don't think I bothered. You can also use the handles down here to adjust the contrast and value range of the image, but I actually did not do that this time around because I like to use the camera raw filter for those sorts of adjustments. So at this point, I actually merged all my previous layers into a new base image, and then I'm going to use the camera raw filter. So go to Filter, Camera Raw. This is probably the most user-friendly way of editing images in Photoshop. It's a lot like Lightroom, if you've ever used Lightroom. It's just got a ton of editing controls right here in this nice interface. And you can just fine-tune the white balance, the tint, temperature, exposure, contrast, play with the highlights and shadows. The editing workflow in the Camera Raw filter is almost exactly what you would find in most editing apps on mobile. So Instagram, or some of the other editing applications on iOS and Android. And it's just really easy to use. So what I did was, I think I increased the contrast in mine, and I also increased the texture and clarity. If you want tutorials on the Camera Raw filter, I would say to look on YouTube. But the best way to get the hang of it is honestly just to play around with these controls and see what they do to your image, and keep trying until you get a result that you like. So this was what my image looked like after I applied the Camera Raw filter. It's not, it's not a drastic change. I made the highlights a little bit more orange, whereas they were yellow before. I tuned up the texture and clarity, as I said, and gave it a little bit of sharpening. And this was pretty close to what I went with for the final image. After that, I did a color balance adjustment layer. And it looks like all I did was increase the saturation of the magentas. I added a glow layer, which is subtle, but puts a little bit of glow on the trees and on the snowflakes. The way I do glow layers is to Control A, Shift Control C, Control V, Image, Adjustments, Levels. I push the levels all the way to the right, so all that we have left are the highlights. Then I go to Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. That's going to put a radius on the highlights. And so something like that is probably pretty good. I hit OK. And then you switch this layer from normal to screen, and that becomes a glow layer, which you can turn on and off. You don't want to leave that at 100% though. I tune it way down, probably to something like 8. You don't want to be over the top with that. But it can be a nice effect. 8 might be a little bit low. I think I ended up going with something around there, like 34%. So that's how you do a glow layer. And that was basically it. That was my new base. And then I did decide really late in the process that I wanted to put a little bit more light on these trees. And so I did a final brightness and contrast adjustment. And this was the final render. So that's my basic post-processing. It's nothing too complicated. The camera raw filter lets you do so much, and it's so easy to use. So that is the finished image. So I hope you guys had fun watching this and picked up a couple tips and tricks here and there. It was a lot of fun to make, a lot of unique challenges like the snow. I've never done anything quite like this with Podium before, so it was fun to do. And I think the result is pretty cool. So again, Merry Christmas if you celebrate Christmas. I hope you got to spend some time with friends and family and had a safe and happy holiday. And I'll see you guys in the next video.